I'm going to speak on how this country was founded. I'd be happy to take questions later on how this country is today. But I thought I'd give a historical perspective. And let me begin by saying that if the Republic of India was a startup, no one would have funded it in August 1947. No one thought that this startup, this new addition to the Committee of Nations, would survive. India was written off at birth. And it was written off at birth for good reasons. The Republic of India is the most reckless political experiment in human history. It's the most ambitiously reckless and recklessly ambitious attempt to construct a nation state in extremely inhospitable and infertile soil. Never before was a country so divided and so large, constituted as a single nation, and never was a country so poor, a large proportion of whose citizens were illiterate given the vote. So if India was a startup, no one would have invested in it. Now, India was founded in August 1947, and shortly after its founding, it received a body blow. The death of its principal architect, Mohandas K. Gandhi. And when Gandhi died, the day afterwards, a British civil servant called Malcolm Darling, who had served for many years in India and was extremely sympathetic to Indians, he was not a normal ICS officer, he wrote in his diary, Gandhi was assassinated yesterday. This is the end of civilization in India. Very difficult to say what will happen, but it is as if a ship has lost its keel. Further disintegration seems inevitable. And then Darling continues. What will happen to the 40 million Muslims left behind in India now that they have lost their chief protector? Nehru will be the next victim. And then this is Darling's last sentence in his diary entry, a British ICS officer, sympathetic to India, writing. I wonder if sooner or later we will have to go back. So here is a prediction that this country will not run. We will have to go back to run it because the Motilal Oswal of that place has died. Okay, now that's January 31st. 6 weeks later, the prediction gets more dire. Gandhi, as you know, was assassinated by a right-wing Hindu fanatic. 6 weeks later, a group of left-wing fanatics under the umbrella of the Communist Party of India gathered at a secret conclave in Calcutta and declared war on the Indian state, the infant Indian state. The CPI decided that this was a false freedom, ye azadi jhuti hai, and on the model of Soviet Russia or Communist China, we will launch an insurrection. So this infant baby state was pierced from the right and pinched by the left. And a few months after this, there was another prediction on this startup. Again, by a person who knew India very well, the last British commander-in-chief of the Indian Army, General Claude Auchinleck. Again, someone very sympathetic to India and Indians. This is what he's writing in September 1948, a year after this company, this firm, this startup, this country has been formed. This is Auchinleck. The Sikhs, because you see the Muslims had already set up their state, Pakistan. Now, Auchinleck is saying in September 1948, against the backdrop of partition, civil war, a communist insurrection, food scarcity, the problem of the integration of the princely states, Auchinleck is writing in September 1948. The Sikhs will set up a separate regime. That will be the start of a general decentralization and breakup of the idea that India is a country. It is not a country. It is a subcontinent as varied as Europe. The Punjabi is as different from a Madrasi as a Scot is from an Italian. The British tried to consolidate it but achieved nothing permanent. And this is the last line of Auchinleck's prediction, September 1948. No one can make a nation out of a continent of many nations. Now, why were these predictions falsified? I've given you two. I could give you many others, including several from that great British statesman and even greater opponent of Indian freedom, Winston Churchill. So we were written off at birth. Why did we survive? How did this staggeringly divided and diverse country become a nation? And how has it stayed largely democratic and largely united? Because of the quality of its first two generations of political leaders and the institutions they built and nurtured. And my talk is going to focus on 6 of these leaders, several well-known. The last person I'll come to is not well-known. But even among the well-known, I hope I will alert you to some less well-known dimensions of their work. And I will also try and take you beyond the false and mischievous oppositions set up by the political discourse of today. And just to preempt and to alert you of the kinds of things I'm going to say, take Nehru and Patel. In the popular discourse of today, Nehru and Patel are regarded as opponents, whereas in historical reality, they were partners and comrades. This has happened because the Congress has disowned Patel and the BJP has misowned Patel. But listen to as I go along and try and understand what these people were doing in their time. And before Nehru and Patel, I'm going to begin with Gandhi, who in many ways was one of the greatest, was arguably the greatest modern Indian. And I'm going to focus on one of the least remembered campaigns of this great modern Indian. Gandhi went on 3 padayatras, or walking tours. 2 are absolutely famous. One was the Salt March in 1930, when he marched to the sea from his ashram in Ahmedabad with 70 companions to breach a tendentious and oppressive British law. That's famous, captured on camera. It's the centerpiece of Attenborough's film. That's the first Padayatra, 1930. The second Padayatra, almost as well known, was in 1946-47, when Gandhi marched through the villages of eastern Bengal, the district of Noakhali in particular, trying to bring about peace and reconciliation between Hindus and Muslims who had recently been at war. But between these 2 great Padayatras, these 2 famous, celebrated Padayatras, was a third, which is virtually forgotten. It's not taught in our textbooks, it was not in Attenborough's film, and few Indians know about it. But arguably, this Padayatra was even more significant than the Salt March, and as significant as the Noakhali Padayatra. This was a Padayatra that Gandhi undertook in the winter of 1933-34, and it was against the practice of untouchability. You know, Gandhi was opposed to untouchability from the start. At the Nagpur Congress of 1920, which is the time Gandhi formally and authoritatively achieves leadership of the Congress in the freedom struggle, at that Congress, Gandhi said in 1920, we will achieve Swaraj only if we abolish untouchability. How can we ask for freedom from the foreign oppressor if we practice a form of discrimination akin to slavery to so many of our own people? So his commitment to untouchability was of old standing. But very often, his commitment to ending untouchability took second place to the struggle for freedom, because the desire of the young people, the desire of his great followers, Nehru and Patel and Bose, was freedom must come first, and after we are free, we'll deal with untouchability. Well, in the early 30s, Gandhi came up against the challenge of B.R. Ambedkar. Ambedkar, much younger than Gandhi, 23 years younger than Gandhi, educated in this city, taught in this city, in Wilson College and later as principal of the Government Law College, went to Columbia to do a PhD, came back and started mobilizing the former untouchables as someone from within. Gandhi was an upper caste reformer, a Baniya by birth, who was acutely aware of the discrimination against untouchables, but had never felt it himself. Ambedkar, on the other hand, came from that community and it had been stigmatized from birth, had been alerted to his inferior social status in the home, in the school, in the street, at the village well, and added to this intense pain that he had felt was a penetrating intelligence and analytical ability and an absolutely restless determination to end the system. So he comes back in the late 1920s and starts challenging Gandhi. And there are many kind of aspects to the debate, how Gandhi and he disagree. They both agree on the need to end untouchability. But Ambedkar thinks that Gandhi is going too slow. Ambedkar thinks that Gandhi should attack the system frontally and directly. And in a sense, the ending of social discrimination against Dalits for Ambedkar is much more important than winning freedom. Because what's the point of winning freedom from the British if you're going to install a new set of masters, Brahmins and Baniyas, who will oppress the Dalits maybe even more than the British had done? So Gandhi is challenged by Ambedkar. Ambedkar thinks that Gandhi is going too slow. On the other hand, the Hindu orthodoxy thinks that Gandhi is going too fast. Ambedkar thinks that Gandhi is an incremental reformer. The Hindu orthodoxy, embodied in the Shankaracharyas, thinks that Gandhi is a dangerous radical. Gandhi is a Baniya, not a Brahmin. He does not know Sanskrit. So say the Shankaracharyas. In a collective petition that they send to the British government, the Shankaracharyas say, declare Gandhi a non-Hindu because he has no business legislating on our practices. Untouchability is sanctioned by the scriptures. And who is Gandhi to seek to end it? So Gandhi is caught between those like Ambedkar, who think he's going too slow, and the Shankaracharyas, who are attacking him for being a reformer in too much of a hurry. So in the winter of 1933-34, he goes on a padayatra against untouchability. He suspends the national movement. He's jailed after the Salt March. He comes out, goes to the Round Table Conference, comes back, is jailed again, comes out of jail in 1933 and suspends civil disobedience. He says, no, for the next few years, all I will do is campaign against untouchability. And he goes around the country, and his methods are not dissimilar to Ashish Dhawan and Pramod Sinha and the like. He also goes to a hall like this and tries to raise money. So he goes to a village. In that winter of 33-34, he covers the present-day states of Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, Orissa, Kerala, Karnataka, Goa, Maharashtra, parts of Madhya Pradesh, parts of Orissa, parts of Bengal. So he goes everywhere. And I hope your roadshow is also going to some of these other places. The difference, of course, is that unlike, he's not speaking to a city audience, Gandhi, he's speaking to village audiences. And he's proselytizing against untouchability. He's telling the Hindus that if you want to be fit for freedom, you must stop discrimination according to caste. You must raise scholarships to send Harijans, which is what he calls the untouchables, Harijan children to schools. And I am raising a fund to educate Harijans, to provide them health care. And will you contribute to it? And these are his methods from which I believe perhaps Ashish and company can learn a little bit. So he's in a village audience, and he says, okay, how many of you will give money for this noble cause of ending untouchability? So a few guilt-ridden Hindus start putting 4 anna, 8 anna, 1 rupee. Then the collection stops. Then he says, okay. From his jhola, he picks out signed photographs of himself. And he says, how many of you are willing to give money to end untouchability in exchange for a signed photograph of me? So the collection goes a little further. Then he says the collection stops. Then Gandhi recognizes that many people admire Nehru more than him, especially women admire Nehru more than him, because he's younger, he's more charismatic. So from his jhola, he picks out autographed photos of Nehru, and he goes around. He says, how many of you are willing to give 1 rupee each? Now, 1 rupee then was probably 1,000 rupees now, or 5,000 rupees now. So the collection goes third round. Then he has photographs of Subhash Bose, for those who admire Subhash Bose. For Muslims in the audience, he has autographed photographs of Maulana Azad, and he goes on and on and on. And this is an extraordinary march, which really shows the commitment of Gandhi to ending this obnoxious social system. And I think at the time, it was not recognized for how significant and important it was, because he was pressed and challenged by Ambedkar. Here is a man 25 years older than Ambedkar, who takes the challenge of this young radical seriously and suspends the movement for freedom to focus on the ending of caste discrimination. And it's a fascinating debate. It's going on. You know, it's a sign of Gandhi's greatness that he's willing to abandon what seems to be more pressing, political freedom, to work towards the creation of equal citizenship within Hindu and within Indian society. Now, in 1947, India becomes free. Through the 30s and 40s, Ambedkar and Gandhi have been quarreling. Ambedkar has been outside the Congress. He dislikes Gandhi, but he dislikes Nehru and Patel even more because, according to Ambedkar, Gandhi is paying lip service to untouchability, ending of untouchability, but Nehru and Patel are not doing even that. As the time comes for the British to withdraw, as the time comes to constitute the first cabinet of free India, Ambedkar, who is a great adversary of Gandhi and Patel and Nehru in the Congress, finds a place. It's an extraordinary act of generosity and reconciliation. There is no clear evidence as to why this happened. One version based on oral history rather than on documents tells us that Gandhi told Nehru and Patel, independence is coming to India, not to the Congress party. Independence is coming to India, not to the Congress party. So the first cabinet must have the best minds regardless of political affiliation. So interestingly, the first finance minister of India is a businessman from Madras called Shanmugam Shetty, who was also a lifelong opponent of the Congress party. Among the cabinet members is Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, who later founds the Jan Sangh, also an opponent of the Congress party, and above all Nehru, above all Ambedkar. To get Ambedkar elected to the Constituent Assembly, Patel gets a congressman from Bombay to resign his seat, and Ambedkar is then nominated in his place. And that's how he comes to write the Indian Constitution. In 2008, President Obama became the first African American to become president. 60 years before that, something as radical and remarkable had happened in our country. And it's a sign of perhaps how unconscious Indians are about their historical legacy, that not much more was made of it, that not many people drew the parallels between what had happened in America in 2008 and what had happened in our country 60 years before that. Because as sociologists will tell you, the system of caste is directly comparable to the system of race. You know, the stigmatization of the African Americans, the blacks, their consignment to the most menial, the most servile, the most degrading professions is exactly comparable to the stigmatization of untouchables in traditional Indian society. And long before Ambedkar, long before Obama had broken that particular barrier, Ambedkar was here in this country. Now, in that cabinet of Free India, Ambedkar was law minister, but had played an important role, which I don't wish to minimize at all. Yet in many ways, the great partnership in that cabinet was between Nehru and Patel. Nehru and Patel worked together in the Congress party. Gandhi, as early as the late 1930s, had said, these are the two people who will succeed me. My political mantle will rest on their shoulders. Now, shortly after independence, Nehru and Patel started having disagreements. And these disagreements were partly about personality, partly about division of responsibilities. Patel thought this is a cabinet system in which the Prime Minister is only first among equals. Nehru thought that as the Prime Minister, he could oversee what his colleagues were doing. And in fact, there was a major rift. And on the day that Gandhi died, 30th January, Patel met Gandhi before his prayer meeting, sat for an hour, explained those differences. After his prayer meeting, Gandhi was going to meet with Nehru, who was going to give his side of the differences. And Gandhi was late for the prayer meeting because this discussion with Patel went on and on, which is why when he went for the meeting and Godse came, Gandhi said, "You're late." That was the words he told him. Because he thought he's coming to touch my feet, but he was already 10 minutes late for the meeting. Now, Gandhi was murdered. In his lifetime, he may not have been able to effect a reconciliation between Nehru and Patel. But in his death, he surely did. And there's a wonderful series of letters exchanged between Nehru and Patel in the first week of February 1948. I don't know whether these letters are on the net. They are there in the selected works of Sardar Patel. But they give the lie to the tendentious representation of a rivalry between Nehru and Patel. Because both people are saying that with Gandhi gone, we have to submerge our differences. We have to unite this country. Everything has changed. And between February 1948 till Patel's death 3 years later, in December 1950, they work together. They work solidly together, and they create and craft a partnership in which each person knows what the other person is better at. Patel knew that only Nehru could unite all of India. Patel was a remarkable man, but he was constrained and confined by his upbringing. Patel was essentially a Gujarati Hindu, whereas Nehru was a North Indian who appealed to South Indians, a Hindu who was trusted by Muslims, a man greatly admired by women. Patel was a patriarch with the prejudices that came with that tribe. And as Patel very well knew, unlike him, Nehru had both an international standing and an interest in global affairs. So contrary to what you read online, contrary to what certain politicians tell you, Patel never wanted to be Prime Minister. He always knew that as a symbol of unity, unity between genders, communities, generations, Nehru was much better than him, much better placed than him. At the same time, Nehru knew that Patel had much greater administrative abilities than him and was also a much better reconciler. So Nehru left two critical jobs to Patel. One, which is well known, is the integration of the princely states. Here you had at independence the British scuttling, leaving India with the problem of bringing 500 princes and maharajas on board one by one, striking separate deals with each one of them so that they would exchange their land in return for titles and a privy purse. And this kind of meticulous negotiation, case by case, Nehru knew only Patel could do. But Nehru also knew that getting someone like Ambedkar on board and getting the Congress in the Constituent Assembly to agree to the radical changes that Ambedkar was promoting to bring about the equality of castes and genders was something only Patel could do, because Patel had command of the Congress party. So between 1948, February 1948, and December 1950, Nehru and Patel worked together. And in those crucial 2.5 years, They united India. They quelled the communist insurgency. They brought all the princely states on board, including the defiant Hyderabad, where the Nizam had held out for independence. And Hyderabad was a country larger than France and extending across the heart of India. As Patel famously said, it's a cancer across the heart of India. But Patel was able to integrate the states. Nehru and Patel, between them, were able to contain and quell the communist insurgency. They were able to craft a constitution based on universal adult franchise, multi-party democracy, federalism, religious and linguistic diversity, the equality for women. All this happened between 1947 and 1950. In December 1950, Patel died. Now, Nehru was more or less in charge. He had no real opposition within the Congress party. And on his own, he did two critical things in the years 1950 to 56, which I'd like to very briefly dwell upon. One is the reform of Hindu personal laws to give equal rights to women. So 85% of the population, women got equal rights. This was not extended to Muslims, partly because there were still the raw wounds of partition. And this task was left for future generations. It never got done, which is a separate story. But had Nehru and Ambedkar, as law minister, not worked together, even the 85% of women who have equal rights in terms of the right to marry someone of your choice, the right to divorce a brutal or callous husband, the right to disregard caste restrictions in the way you conduct your marriage, the right to inherit property, ancestral property, all rights that were denied to them by the traditional patriarchal systems of Hindu law, these were achieved largely by Nehru and Ambedkar against the defiance and the opposition of the Hindu orthodoxy. The second, and arguably in my view, well, there were three. So the first was gender equality, substantial in law, not in social practice, but at least in law. That was the first thing that after Patel's death, Nehru was able to achieve. The second thing was the principle of linguistic states. Now, this is a complex question, and there's a long debate about it. But essentially, Gandhi was clear that when India became independent, every major linguistic group would have its province. After independence and partition, Nehru and Patel hummed and hawed. They thought we've had a balkanization on the basis of religion. Will we have another balkanization on the basis of language? But finally, Nehru was persuaded, and linguistic states were formed. And in retrospect, this was absolutely visionary. In the same year, 1956, as linguistic states were formed in India, and the states of Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Orissa, later Maharashtra, Gujarat came into being, in the same year, in Sri Lanka, a policy of Sinhala as the only national language was imposed on the whole island, including the Tamils of the north. The imposition of a single national language created a civil war in Sri Lanka that has lasted till today. The imposition of Urdu by Jinnah on East Pakistan led to the Bangladesh movement. So linguistic pluralism, in many ways, has saved India from fragmentation. That was also principally Nehru's contribution. And the last contribution of Nehru, which I'd like to flag, was his absolute commitment to religious pluralism. Like Gandhi, Nehru was willing to stake his life for Hindu-Muslim unity. And he was determined that whatever happened in Pakistan, India would not be a Hindu Pakistan. In whatever way Pakistan treated its minorities, Sikhs and Christians and Hindus who were persecuted mercilessly in Pakistan from the day Pakistan was born, in India, those Muslims, those Christians, those Sikhs, those Jews, those Parsis who stayed in India would have equal rights as Hindus. Now, there were two kinds of partnerships at work in those early years of the last decade of the Indian freedom struggle and the early years of independence. In the 30s and 40s and 50s, there were two partnerships at work. One was a real partnership between Nehru and Patel working together, first in the freedom struggle, then in the cabinet, the first cabinet of Free India. But there was also an unacknowledged partnership between Gandhi and Ambedkar. Gandhi was challenging the caste system from above. Ambedkar was challenging it from below. The methods they used were different. The language they used varied. But ultimately, for any system to change, you need reform from above and reform from below. If you look at how the civil rights movement in the United States succeeded, it was because Martin Luther King's movement was accompanied by Lyndon Johnson's social reforms. So there were two partnerships at work, one between Nehru and Patel, a second between Gandhi and Ambedkar, and later between Ambedkar, Patel, and Nehru working together to forge the Constitution. And what these various initiatives did was to create a unified national territory. Now, this was extraordinarily difficult. I mean, we who are born much later don't realize how difficult it was to create a unified national territory. A territory in which the writ of the state, the writ of the Constitution ran across. I'm speaking in Bombay. Some years ago, I was speaking in my hometown, Bangalore, to a younger audience of new recruits to Infosys. And I asked them, I said, how many of you are from north of the Vindhyas? And about 40% raised their hands. The next year, I was speaking in Delhi to the young executives of a big Delhi company, Max, and I asked the same question. How many of you are from south of the Vindhyas? And again, about 40 or 50% raised their hands. And I told both audiences, I said, do you realize that if Hyderabad had been independent, you couldn't have come here to get your job? So the creation of a national market, a national territory, led in time to a creation of a national market. So what I'm trying to tell you is that the initiatives of Nehru, Patel, Ambedkar, Gandhi, without those initiatives, what Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh were to do in the 1990s would not have happened. And I think this is something all of you in this room should consider and reflect upon. Not only did you create a unified territory and a national market, more importantly, you created a democratic society that not only granted citizens rights to elect their leaders, but also promoted equality of caste, gender, faith, and language. Now, these are the four fundamental axes of division in India: caste, gender, religion, and language. Now, these were removed in law. Social practice may have lagged behind law. There may still be instances of oppression of Dalits. We do know of continuing violence to women. We do know of Hindu-Muslim conflict. We do know of clashes between Maharashtrians and non-Maharashtrians in the city. But unless you created the template in law of equality, equality of caste, religion, gender, and language, you would never have taken the first step towards creating a democratic society. You look at our neighbors. I talked about Sri Lanka. Look at Pakistan. Pakistan, legally, there's discrimination against non-Muslims. There's discrimination against non-Urdu speakers. In Bangladesh today, you look at the attacks, for example, on atheists. So, and the attacks are partly enabled because Bangladesh, like Pakistan, is an Islamic republic. Sri Lanka is a Buddhist republic officially. And not only is it a Buddhist republic officially, it's also a republic in which Sinhala is the main national language. And the greatness of Gandhi and Nehru and Patel was not to reduce nation or nationality to a single language or a single religion. And we Indians who were born after all this happened, and our children and our grandchildren perhaps don't recognize. We take this unity and democracy for granted. This freedom, this mobility to move across states from one city to another, to marry someone who's not from your caste, to divorce a brutal husband, to demand rights denied to you, granted to you by the Constitution, but denied to you in daily practice. We take all this for granted. But it took extraordinary amount of hard work because the soil was unpropitious. As Ambedkar famously said, democracy in India is top dressing on inhospitable soil. No country, and this I say as a historian, and please take these comments in the spirit in which they are offered. Don't call me unpatriotic or anti-Indian or anti-Bharat or whatever. As a historian, I can tell you that as far as complex civilizations go, if you compare the Indian civilization to the European or the African, we historically perfected discrimination, stratification, hierarchy much more rigorously and systematically. There is no equivalent to the caste system either in Christianity or in Islam. And Hinduism and Islam both are two major religions in scripture and in social practice seriously discriminated against women. So to go against this inhospitable soil, to work at least in law, to working towards a society that would not discriminate on the basis of caste, gender, religion, or language, and more importantly, to do it in a democratic way, without the use of force. You know, I've been reading a book on Turkey, where Kemal Ataturk tried to do the same thing, but through force. And, you know, its effects are still felt. Much smaller country, much more homogeneous. In a country as large and diverse as this, if we had not adopted the method of debate, dialogue, democracy, who knows? We would have broken up into 20 or 30 parts, as those predictions that I outlined in the beginning of my talk very clearly thought we would. Now, I'm going to move on very quickly to two other people. I've spoken about Gandhi, Ambedkar, Patel, and Nehru. I want to move on in the end of my talk to two other great figures, one of whom is not talked about much anymore, and the other is more or less completely forgotten. The first person I want to talk about is Rajagopalachari. Rajagopalachari was a comrade of Nehru and of Patel. He was, as you know, the first Indian Governor General. He was Home Minister in Nehru's cabinet after Patel died. Then he was Chief Minister of Madras. He got disenchanted with the one-party domination of the Congress Party. He also began to have serious reservations about Nehru's policy of socialist economics. So, in 1959, at the age of 80, he started a new political party. Now just think of this. I mean, at 80, just think of what hope it gives all of us. You can have a change of career anytime. Ashish, you have 30 years to start a new political party. I mean, Ashoka will be flying in 30 years. It will be, you know, as in 30 years you can start a new political party to change India, right? Now, at the age of 80, this extraordinary figure, and he was extraordinary in many ways. I mean, I'm a Tamil, so I grew up venerating Rajagopalachari. Even if he had never been Home Minister, even if he had never been Governor General, he translated the Ramayana and the Mahabharata for all of us to read. He wrote the first Tamil short stories. He was Gandhi's southern commander. And then at the age of 80, he starts a political party that meant a break with his dearest friends and comrades, with whom he had spent not years but decades together in jail. And it meant not only breaking with your comrades, it meant challenging the dominant economic philosophy of the day. Because in the 1950s, Nehru was not exceptional. All across the world, it was believed that the way forward for economic development was for the state to play a dominant role. It was believed that because the state had played a dominant role in Japanese economic development, Japan had prospered. Likewise in Russia. In 1959, Sputnik went into orbit. And the Americans thought the Russians know more than us about technology and economics. I mean, the dominant economic philosophy of the day in the 1950s was not market-led growth, it was state-led economic growth. Rajaji at the age of 80, and there are some who think only the young have new ideas. At the age of 80, he starts a new political party committed to economic freedom And he coins a term which really captures the whole epoch of Indian economic history: license, permit, quota raj. Now that's what I want to end. At the age of 80, starts a political party to oppose Nehru, who's a colossus, who never lost an election, and mobilizes support, including some in this city, for a worthwhile cause, and starts the process of breaking the stranglehold of the state over economics in 1959. Now, some of you know about Rajaji's commitment to ending state-centered economic growth and why he really should be rightly celebrated as the intellectual or ideological architect of the market-led reforms of the 1990s and later. But you may not know that while Rajaji broke with Nehru on the question of state-centered economics, he never gave up his commitment to the abolition of untouchability or to the promotion of religious harmony. These he had learned from Gandhi, not from Nehru. He could break with Nehru on the question of economics. But he recognized that in a country so diverse, so divided, we had still miles to go to create equality of citizenship. There's a statement of his, which I'm going to quote to you. It's from 1968. It tells you what a prophetic person he was. That's why Gandhi said, he called Rajaji the keeper of my conscience. He said, if someone disagrees with me, like Ambedkar disagreed with him, I think once. If Rajaji disagrees with me, I think once and I think twice. Now, here is a person who's writing in 1968 on the Jansangh. The Jansangh is the precursor of the Bharatiya Janata Party, which rules India today. Rajaji says in 1968, the Jansangh has quite a few good leaders. Still true today, 50 years later. The Jansangh, just read BJP for Jansangh. The Jansangh has quite a few good leaders, but what it needs is a broad-mindedness that looks upon Muslims, Christians, Parsis and others as politically and culturally as good as Hindus. Now this is what Rajaji says in 1968. So I've spoken about Gandhi, Ambedkar, Nehru, Patel, and briefly about Rajagopalachari. If I was to try and pass or summarize some common attributes that these leaders shared, I'm going to suggest that there were at least 3 common attributes that these leaders shared, which probably all great political leaders share. The first is the willingness to go against the current, to go against the dominant trend in society, and even in one's own party. So think of Gandhi on caste. He is going against the dominant trend in society, which is to justify caste discrimination. Think of Nehru on communalism. He is going against the dominant trend in his society. And think of Rajaji on economics, where he's going against the dominant trend even in the Congress party, of which he's a loyal soldier. I mean, if you think of what it took for Rajaji to break with the Congress party, he joined the Congress party well before Nehru and Patel. In 1916, he joined the Congress party. He'd been a member for 40 years. He'd been an intimate of Gandhi, of Nehru, of Patel, of Rajendra Prasad, of Azad. And 40 years later, he breaks with them because he says no. Before he breaks with the party, it's a very interesting process. In fact, there's a great intellectual biography to be written of Rajaji. His extraordinary and multifaceted contributions. In 1954, he gives up political office. He was Chief Minister of Madras. So for 35 years, he's been in politics. He gives up. He writes the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. That takes him 18 months because complex task. In 1956, he starts thinking. He moves from myth back to reality. And he writes an article in 1956, Wanted a Constructive Opposition. It's an article that is reproduced in my anthology, Makers of Modern India, where he says in 1956, the Congress has no opposition. It's complacent. It's arrogant. As a loyal congressman, he's been a 40 years in the party. As a lawyer's congressman, I don't think it's good for democracy. And this leads 2 years later to the formation of Swatantra. So the first attribute of leaders is the willingness to go against the current, even against in your own society, your own party, your own company, your own university, whatever. Second, once one has decided to take the unfashionable route, there must be a commitment to building a consensus through patient hard work, to bring colleagues or even opponents on board. If you think of the way in which Gandhi brought Ambedkar into the first cabinet, the way in which Nehru was able to persuade others in the Congress that creating linguistic states would not lead to the balkanization of India. And finally, the open-mindedness to other cultures, other ways of thinking, the willingness to broaden your mind and to change one's mind if the situation so demanded. Again, I'll give you one example from Rajaji, which is absolutely the last example I'll give, but it tells you a great deal about the man and the kind of politics he practiced and the kind of lessons all of us can learn from someone like Rajaji. In 1959, he started the Swatantra Party, which led to a bitter breach between Nehru and him. Close and intimate comrades. They had a huge fight. And there were sharp words exchanged, not only in the press, but during the election of 1962, when the Swatantra Party made its debut. Towards the end of 1962, as you know, the Chinese attacked India. And we suffered a humiliating defeat, and Nehru, of course, bore much of the humiliation himself. At this time, Sheikh Abdullah, the leader of Kashmir, had been 10 years in jail. From late 1963, Nehru begins moves to release Sheikh Abdullah because he wants to bring about a final resolution of the Kashmir dispute. Nehru knows that India already faces a hostile neighbor in China. We can't really afford to have a second hostile neighbor in Pakistan. So he says we must release Abdullah and send him to Pakistan to find a way in which we can resolve the Kashmir dispute on terms honorable to both parties. Now, everyone is mad with Nehru for releasing Abdullah, because back in 1953, Abdullah had been jailed because he wanted Kashmiri independence. But 10 years in jail had tempered Abdullah. Abdullah also wanted a resolution. So he talks to Nehru. The Jansangh is angry, the socialists are angry, but Rajaji says no. We have to solve the Kashmir dispute. He tells Abdullah, you come to Madras and meet me. They discuss ways in which you can have a kind of joint sovereignty over Kashmir between the valley, between India and Pakistan, of the kind that is practiced, those of you who know Europe, over Andorra, which is a beautiful mountain area like Kashmir in between France and Spain, nominally independent, but with a joint sovereignty exercised by the Bishop of Catalan and the Prime Minister of France. So they discuss all this. And then Abdullah goes to Pakistan and is on the verge of a breakthrough when Nehru dies. Abdullah comes back, the peace process breaks down. A few months later, Abdullah goes on Hajj, and as it happens, he's in Algiers when Chow En-lai is visiting. Some paranoid intelligence agent sees both of them in the same hotel, reports it back to Delhi, and Shastri arrests Abdullah, and that's the end of honorable solution to the Kashmir dispute. But at this moment, Rajaji lends his entire moral weight to his principal political opponent, because he knows how much the dispute over Kashmir has cost India economically, militarily, and morally. So that's really an extraordinary example of leadership, that when it comes to the larger national interest, you must, especially on questions such as foreign policy, you must disregard partisan political interest. I'm going to end with a few paragraphs or a few sentences on someone who, in my view, is as extraordinary or was as extraordinary as Rajaji or Ambedkar or Nehru or Patel, but is completely forgotten today. She was Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay. I won't embarrass anyone in this room by asking how many of you know about her, because certain young people don't. And even if the people my age know about her, they don't know the least about her. You know, she was someone whose career, in many ways, was even more gloriously varied than that of Rajagopalachari. So I'm going to give you a brief biography of a woman who was unquestionably the greatest Indian woman of the 20th century and a maker of modern India who qualifies with the likes of Nehru, Patel, Ambedkar, and Rajaji. Not Gandhi, because I feel Gandhi is, in many ways, in a level of his own. I would have to say that because I'm spending 20 years on writing a 3-volume biography of Gandhi. So I have to say that, right? But anyway, Kamala Devi is on the level of these people. And I'll tell you briefly why. Kamala Devi was born in 1903 in Mangalore on the coast of Karnataka. She was a child widow, like was common in Brahmin families of those days. She was married off at the age of 13. Her husband died. She is left bereft. What does she do? She says, I want to educate myself. She goes to Madras, joins Queen Mary College, where she meets Sarojini Naidu's brother, Harindranath Chattopadhyay, falls in love, marries him. And he was an actor, so she starts a career in theatre. They go around taking plays across South and West India. She's based in Pune for a bit. Now just think, a Brahmin woman in the 1920s involved in street theatre. I mean, it's a colossal transgression. A child widow marrying a Bengali, a Kannadiga child widow marrying a Bengali, and then getting into theatre in the 1920s. Then she says, you know, culture is not enough, what about politics? So she stands for a seat in the Madras Assembly in 1927. Loses, but honorably, you know, it's not in the kind of patriarchal prejudice of the time. It's not easy for a woman to fight an election and win, especially on a limited franchise where most of the people who can vote are educated or propertied men. But she says, I'm going to stand. Then Gandhi starts the Salt March. By this time, she's become a committed nationalist. Gandhi starts the Salt March. He's marching from Ahmedabad to Dandi. She stops him, or no, she doesn't stop him. Gandhi halts at a village called Ras, which is halfway, and she goes there. And she says, Gandhiji, women must also join the Salt March. We must also break the law and court arrest. And Gandhi is very nervous because Gandhi wants to emancipate women just as he wants to emancipate Dalits, but he wants to do it one step at a time. He's already annoyed Hindu orthodoxy so much by challenging untouchability. Can he afford to have women go to jail where there's a male jailer of a different caste? So he says, no. You should know, what about women? He says, no, okay. If women want to be involved in the freedom struggle, they should picket liquor stills and oppose alcoholism. That's okay. They can wear khadi saris. That's also okay. But they cannot break the salt law. She says, sorry, I'm going to do it. So she defies him and breaks the salt march. And then finally, many more women joined the salt satyagraha. So she brings women directly, not only the freedom struggle, not as backroom women, but as courting arrest up front. In fact, there's a story which is related in the second volume of my Gandhi biography of Kamala Devi taking a packet of salt that she has made herself by breaking the law and going to the Bombay Stock Exchange and auctioning it. You know, I think she gets 501 rupees for that, you know. It must have been a Motilal Oswal or Rakesh Jhanjhunwala of that day, right? So, you just think of that society and how prejudiced it is. So that's the next stage. She joins the Salt March, she goes to jail. She spent several years in jail. She comes out and she founds the All India Women's Conference. You know, I was in the 1930s. One of the first feminist organizations arguing for women's rights. By this time, her marriage with Harindranath is breaking up. He was I'm sorry to use the phrase, but it's accurate. He was a serial philanderer. She's had enough of him. So she leaves him and she starts traveling the world. She goes to China, she goes to Japan, and in the late 30s, she goes to the American South, where she sees the oppression against Negroes as they are then known. She meets some Negro activists and tells them about Satyagraha, how you can defy laws, as Gandhi did, how you can challenge racial discrimination by taking a white friend and going into a bar which says whites only. So African Americans had heard about Gandhi. And from the 1920s, the African American press is following Gandhi. They're interested in him, they're intrigued by him, they want to know whether they can actually emulate his methods. This is long before Martin Luther King, this is the 20s and 30s. But Kamala Devi is the first Indian who is the direct bridge between Gandhi and Martin Luther King. She travels around the American South in the 1930s in a really racially divided environment, an Indian woman going by bus, by train, taking the message of civil disobedience to African Americans who were to put these lessons into operation in the 50s and 60s. That is just one part of Kamala Devi's life. She comes back, and Nehru offers her a job in the cabinet. She refuses. Instead, she works on refugee rehabilitation. The town of Faridabad was originally built by Kamala Devi, resettling artisans from the Northwest Frontier Province. So she works on refugee rehabilitation. Then the next phase of her life is reviving handicrafts. You know, artisanal products. If Indian artisans, you know, people who, silk weavers, you know, the bastar, people who work with bell metal, so many of our glorious handicrafts, if these artisans have a national and world market, it's because of Kamala Devi, because she starts work to reviving, restoring, forming associations that will market these handicrafts across India and the world. So she's an actor, a freedom fighter, a feminist, a global proselytizer for Satyagraha, a social worker who rehabilitates refugees, a reviver of handicrafts. And along the way, she founds the All India Women's Conference, the Indian Cooperative Union, the Sangeet Natak Academy, the Central Cottage Industries Emporium, the Crafts Council of India, the Crafts Museum, and the India International Center. A way to go, Ashish and Pramath and all of you. You have a lot of hard work ahead of you. Now, if you look at Kamala Devi's life, what does it tell you? The message of Nehru's and Patel's life is the contribution that can be made by principled and focused leadership in government. The message of Ambedkar's and Rajaji's life is the contribution that principled and focused leadership can make in opposition, in political opposition. And the message of Kamala Devi's life, which I think Indians are now realizing in abundance, and in, I would say, with no intention of flattering my host, that in some strange way, Ashoka is inheriting the legacy of Kamala Devi, because the legacy of her life is that visionary leadership is as crucial in civil society as in politics and business. That's really the lesson of her life. I will end here, and I'd be happy to take questions, but allow me to make just one last remark. I started by saying that if India was a startup in 1947, no one would have invested in it. In my book, India After Gandhi, which was published 10 years ago, I said, this is 2007, 9 years ago, I said, and I wrote it in 2006. So 10 years ago, I wrote, as a multilingual, multi-religious political entity, the Republic of India anticipated the European Union by 40 years. 10 years later, allow me to say that as a multilingual, multi-religious political entity, the Republic of India will outlive the European Union also by 40 years. Thank you.